Destruction and corruption are forms of creation in themselves.
Wow, you sound like a serial killer.
What?
Destruction and corruption are beautiful forms of creation in themselves.
I don't sound like that.
You absolutely sound like that.
Cutscenes are such an integral part of modern games that explaining them almost feels redundant. It's almost rare for a game nowadays not to at least start with the main character listening to a bunch of cryptic exposition that may or may not get explained. And even when that doesn't apply, there are always going to be scenes where characters talk to each other, either verbally or using a bunch of circles. Cutscenes help progress the story in video games at points where simply using gameplay doesn't help. They're used to provide context and answer questions such as, why are you killing this guy? Why am I in a hospital? I do wonder what Ganon's up to. Modern game stories can be so complex and thematic that cutscenes are pretty much required to help the player understand what is going on. However, that only started to happen when we had the ability to tell these stories. In the 80s and 90s, games followed very simple plots that didn't require visual storytelling. Rescuing a princess, defeating the aliens, correctly investing in stocks to gain a $600 billion investment while avoiding certain tax write-offs. But even if these games had in-depth stories, there was no way for the designers to explain them the way they intended. What usually happened was you got a big-ass brochure that came with the game, and you had to read through every single page like a caveman. You see, NES cartridges, as huge and thick as they were, could hold a single megabyte at most, whereas this tiny little SSD can hold 512 gigabytes. Because of this, designers had to be wary about what they added to games, and cutscenes weren't considered important enough. I mean, to add one, you'd basically need to remove an entire level from the game, and do you think the designers are willing to budge? Of course they aren't. Thankfully, with the advent of the Super Nintendo and the Genesis, games were given 4 times the initial storage size, allowing for bigger and better storytelling, and even some voice acting.
The galaxy is at peace.
Now games can really visualize what's going on, and not use a bunch of stupid text. It seems like we can't get any better than that, and that's only kind of true. Now it's 1995, and the PlayStation just released, and now after being good friends with 2 Dimensions, suddenly this third one comes in and we're like, no more roommates, you guys! The third dimension brought a lot of changes to the world of game design and cutscenes. Now the camera wasn't restricted to looking at the character in just one direction. We can move all around to capture all the emotion coming from these characters' beautifully rendered faces.
Oh yeah! This is happening!
Chris? Take care.
Okay, so this era of cutscenes hasn't really aged the best, but it was still amazing at the time. Being able to employ simple movie techniques like cutting and zooming in on shots to video games was an amazing decision, and it's had an impact on games to this day. After this point, we enter the 6th generation of consoles, where graphics become a bit less vomit-inducing. Big studios start using experimental techniques to make cutscenes like motion capture and real-time rendering, to the point where nowadays, cutscenes are so detailed and story-rich that I don't even mind when Joel interrupts my game to tell me how he's feeling.
Why don't you ask Bill to get you some of them air fresheners?
Hey, if they weren't expired, that'd be a good idea.
But even with these changes and the impressive technology used to make games nowadays, I still get annoyed when a game takes away my power for a few minutes. Maybe it's just my ADHD, but I don't think it's hard for developers to provide context without interrupting gameplay, and I only say that because it's been done before. Half-Life. You may have heard of it, it's a pretty popular game, but one of the best things about it is its approach to storytelling. After you start the game, you're dropped into this room of fellow smart and clever scientists all having their own conversations with each other. Now, let's say you want to listen to every single conversation that every character is having because you're a freak who really wants to know about that guy's back knee. In a normal game, you would be forced to go up to every single character, hit a button, and stand there, silently, listening to every word. Now that's fine, but
How about this instead?
instead of stopping you in your tracks to tell you about how a Black Mesa scientist's day is going, the game gives you the option to either listen to the convo or just walk right past him and move on. What we have here is interactive storytelling, where the player has the choice to be as invested in the story as they want. And this type of storytelling is used throughout the whole game. Throughout all the shooting, jumping, and physics engine messing about, you still have the option of listening in on random conversations, and sometimes what they say is cryptic as hell. Letting the player choose if they want context for why they're killing aliens or whatever the fuck is just amazing. In 2007, Uncharted Drake's Fortune released for the PS3, which tries to pull up the same trick as Half-Life, but doesn't do it quite well. Instead of letting you fully control the character, the game forces you to walk a linear path while the characters discuss personal anecdotes. This type of cutscene works, but it feels pretty monotonous. It makes you think, if the game wants me to pay attention to the dialogue, why is it making me hold the left stick up for an extended period of time? I'm not trying to bash Uncharted, far from it. I just think that forcing a player to hold a single button while listening to Nathan Drake make quips is a lazy use of storytelling that's probably contributed to a lot of the MCU.
So you like cats, Sam?
But what about the opposite? What about a game that decides if they want to tell you a story, they're gonna sit you down, tape you to the seat, and just start screaming at you until you get the gist? You know, Metal Gear Solid's legacy in the gaming landscape is strange, at least to me. I feel like if you pitched the idea of this game nowadays, no one would accept it unless it was pitched by this guy. When designing Metal Gear Solid, Kojima wanted to make absolutely sure that the player was invested in the story. In an IGN interview, Kojima stated, "If the player isn't tricked into believing that the world is real, then there's no point in making the game." To achieve this, Konami filled the game with tons of details that most people didn't notice their first time through. However, the most immersive factor of this game is the ultra-cinematic cutscenes. Look at this absurdity. This is like 9 years before Michael Bay added a bunch of explosions to Transformers, and it still looks amazing. These are some of the most action-packed and intense cutscenes I've ever seen in a video game. In fact, it's so good, I almost forgot that I wasn't even playing. Yeah, what a shock. The game took away my ability to play for so long, but I didn't mind because the cutscene was so engaging. Ironically, a portion of the game that requires no immersion makes you feel immersed. Watching one of these long cutscenes feels like watching a long video essay on YouTube. Only after an hour do I realize how much time has passed. Even without excessive explosions and top-tier voice acting, cutscenes can still deliver context in a meaningful way. Some of the most dramatic moments in gaming happen by just using text bubbles. Two characters simply sharing a moment can have such an impact on how the story flows. Most of this is thanks to the writing. Although, when your game doesn't have famous voice actors and state-of-the-art mocap, bad writing can be easily noticed and ruin the intended feel of a game. But other times, the writing can be rock solid, and it results in some really emotional moments. So overall, I think that out of all types of cutscenes, the 3 that I covered here have the most potential. They can exceed expectations and deliver the story effectively, or they can fumble it completely.